The ADL has turned into a broader social justice movement. ADL has been swept up in that, and it's been very good to them because their fundraising is through the roof.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thank you for joining us. We have a timely interview for you today with William Jacobson of Legal Insurrection. But before we start, I want to encourage everyone to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, we would love to hear from you. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. Now to today's program. The last thing that you'd expect from a group whose historic mission is to monitor and fight anti-Semitism would be to discover that they are helping to spread woke ideological indoctrination that grants a permission slip to Jew hatred. Yet that is exactly what the Anti-Defamation League has been caught doing in a Fox News digital expose that encouraged the fact that curricula that the group gives to schools as part of their widely popular anti-hate programs included critical race theory teachings about white privilege, the need to address the problems of whiteness, praise for the anti-Semitic Women's March group, and support for the idea of contemporary Americans paying reparations to those whose ancestors were slaves. It also buttressed myths about the 2015 shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, that helped give birth to the Black Lives Matter movement. This is shocking, not just because it is one more piece of evidence that the liberal gaslighting about CRT in the schools being a figment of the conservative imagination is a transparent lie. It's also important because due to its adherence to intersectional myths about Israelis being white oppressors of Palestinians who want to destroy the one Jewish state on the planet and American Jews possessing white privilege, CRT legitimizes anti-Semitism, something the ADL still claims to oppose. Faced with the proof that the materials that are distributed in school districts around the nation as part of its anti-hate programs are immersed in these woke leftist ideas that legitimate racialist attitudes that are linked to Jew hatred, the ADL had to admit that the Fox report was accurate. A statement from the group said, "There is content among our curricular materials that is misaligned with ADL's values and strategy." Yet, the ADL still insisted that we do not teach critical race theory, period. Of course, a look at these curricula shows that's exactly what they are doing. But the non-apology was an attempt to pretend that it was all a misunderstanding. Founded in 1913 to address the threat from anti-Semitism, ADL was long considered the authoritative voice on hate and an important resource for both Jews and non-Jews. But in order to believe what Fox discovered was merely a one-off blunder, you'd have to ignore what's been happening to the group in the 7 years since former Clinton and Obama White House staffer Jonathan Greenblatt took over as its CEO, replacing longtime leader Abe Foxman. He shifted the ADL from a nonpartisan Jewish defense organization to being just another liberal activist group whose priority is helping the Democratic Party. Rather than being misaligned with the ADL's mission, endorsements of CRT teachings are very much aligned with its decision to latch on to radical ideas about race so as to remain in touch with liberal democratic fashion. There was its endorsement of the Black Lives Matter movement, which itself had endorsed anti-Semitic attacks on the State of Israel and its anti-racist agenda about white supremacy. It embraced veteran race baiter Al Sharpton, who helped foment the 1991 Crown Heights pogrom against Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn. It defended two anti-Semitic members of Congress, Representatives Ilhan Omar and Rashid Tlaib, against criticism from former President Donald Trump on the basis that they were women of color. Then there was the fact that its website had a definition of racism that invoked CR teachings about privilege. The group's dubious involvement in internet censorship with big tech allies like Google and PayPal, ostensibly to educate against hatred, also wound up promoting extremism rather than stopping it. And that's on top of the fact that Greenblatt has allowed the ADL to become mired in partisan politics by involving it in issues like the battle to confirm Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Even worse is their ongoing campaign to falsely smear former President Donald Trump as the main reason for an increase in anti-Semitism, or for attacks on Jews, even though he was the best friend Israel ever had in the White House, took unprecedented action against anti-Semitism on college campuses, and has closer ties, both in terms of family and close associates, to the Jewish community than any other president. All this speaks to a pattern of behavior that demonstrates that the ADL is mired in leftist ideology, in which it has bought into the BLM agenda of equity as opposed to equality. By emphasizing ideas about race and privilege, even though doing so gives a boost to the lies about Israel being an apartheid state, this undermines the interests and security of the people they're supposed to be standing up for. That's a scandal that illustrates how a once vital group has betrayed its mission. But it's also an illustration of how woke ideas like CRT can act as a toxic influence subverting institutions, including, I might add, the federal government under President Joe Biden, which has embraced the equity agenda, to the point where they become complicit in racism rather than combating it. This also means that if the ADL is to retain even a sliver of credibility, it will require more than a pro forma review about misaligned lesson plans. It's going to take a complete overhaul and a purge of the woke leftism that now permeates almost everything it says and does. The only way to begin that effort is to fire Jonathan Greenblatt. Anything less than that will be further betrayal of the organization's responsibilities to speak up for its founding principles and mission. And now to this week's interview. To discuss the latest on the ADL controversy and the way critical race theory is being pushed into school curricula around the nation, we have perhaps our leading expert on the subject and someone whose research and commentary on it has helped make it both understandable and relevant to a wider audience. William A. Jacobson is a clinical professor of law and director of the Securities Law Clinic at Cornell Law School, where he has taught since 2007. In 2008, he founded the Legal Insurrection website. In 2019, he launched the Legal Insurrection Foundation, a nonprofit research group focusing on promoting free speech and open dialogue, capitalism, free enterprise, and understanding the intersectional left. In the last year, he launched criticalrace.org, a website that catalogs critical race training and higher education and elite private schools through an interactive map. William Jacobson, welcome to Top Story.
Thank you for having me on again.
Well, great. We really appreciate you coming on and speaking with us. I'd like to start by asking you to put the news about ADL, the Anti-Defamation League's model school curricula containing critical race theory doctrines, in perspective. ADL's response seemed to claim that what Fox News Digital reported was a one-off blunder or an accident, not in keeping with their intent or values. But do you think this is true, and how do you believe this happened?
Well, I don't know if it's a one-off thing. It was multiple different lesson plans. I don't know where Fox News got them, but they said they were publicly available. So these were multiple plans all on a same theme. So if it's a one-off problem, then it was a one-off problem at least half a dozen times, which is the number of these plans that I've seen. So maybe that happened. I can't speak to ADL, but I think it is part of a broader problem, which is the ADL has turned into a broader social justice movement. I don't know that social justice is really what they think it is, but that's what they pretend to be. It's more left-wing movement justice. It's more racial and ethnic focused justice. I would disagree that they're doing justice, but it's part of essentially the Black Lives Matter post George Floyd sort of movement that swept campuses. Of course, it started long before that, but ADL has been swept up in that. And it's been very good to them because their fundraising is through the roof, at least what's publicly available. And so these lesson plans, which hopefully we can talk about, particularly as it relates to Michael Brown, are really kind of propaganda. They're not fact-based. They're not in context of anything. And this is what the ADL is putting out. And if they weren't caught doing it, they wouldn't be the least bit apologetic. I'm not sure they're apologetic, but they're willing to take a new look at it. And that, I think, is the problem. The ADL has been swept up in a movement which you and I know is actually, at its core, the leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement who formed it are very anti-Israel and probably very anti-ADL, yet ADL got swept into all this.
Yeah, I want to talk more about the specifics as a little later, but let's take a step back for a moment, though. It's a subject that has become something of a political lightning rod, but many people don't fully understand what critical race theory consists of. On one foot, what is it and why is it so dangerous?
Well, critical race theory is no one thing, and it has varied over time. And it's a little bit amorphous, but what it does is centers race in the analysis of society and of history. And it views racism as endemic to the system. It views it as an everyday occurrence. It views it as something that is bigger than a single person. It's a systemic sort of problem. And it examines the various structures of society, particularly the legal system and now other systems, based on that premise of systemic racism. And it started as critical legal studies. When I was at Harvard Law School, that was the rage. I started in 1981, graduated in 84, and critical legal studies was blossoming. And that essentially looked at the systems, what we would call justice, what we would call the search for truth in the judicial system, as really just a means of ensuring and cementing power of various groups in society. And so they took that, and that then became later critical race studies, which took the same critical approach, that the structures don't do what they're purported to do. They actually just reinforce existing priorities in society and existing power structures. And they applied that to race. And I think that, so what critical race studies is the study of society through a racial lens with the presumption that we are irretrievably racist, that it's not something, a personal choice anybody makes, it's just the society we live in. So that's extremely dangerous. And that has morphed into many different things. Some call it, like Ibram Kendi's anti-racism. And then there's white fragility sort of stuff. And then there's DEI on campuses. But they all have that core critical race studies focus of everything revolves around race. And the damage to society is, and the reason it's so dangerous, is that the entire thrust of the American civil rights movement was to not hyper-focus on race, to treat each person as an individual, that all should be able to participate in the American system and all should be able to participate in the fruits of our society without regard to their skin color and their race. I mean, that's the American civil rights movement, bringing people into the system. What critical race studies and these various offshoots say is that there's no reason to become part of the system because that system is completely corrupted and completely racist and cannot be changed. It essentially needs to be torn down and restructured. And for a society, that's a very dangerous philosophy. That's a very revolutionary philosophy that doesn't seek to bring people into the system and treat everybody equally. It seeks to tear down the system.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to treat race sort of the way other societies treat caste. We all are what we are, and there's no way to escape from it. We're not individuals. Everything is defined by our skin color or our origin, and that creates a very dangerous dynamic for society. But that seems to be exactly what they want. They're not for the people who are pushing this are not for equality. In fact, they seem to be opposing equality and equal opportunity because they have a very different agenda and an illiberal one, don't they?
Well, if you look at what has become the holy scripture of the modern critical race movement on campuses and in some corporations, it's Ibram Kendi's book, How to Become an Anti-Racist. And I first became aware of that book when Cornell University's president announced in the summer of 2020, in this mad rush to virtue signal around the country, that she was going to start an anti-racism initiative on campus, that we were going to become an anti-racist campus. Well, what did that mean? Well, it wasn't clearly explained, but they did recommend for the entire university as recommended summer reading material that would be used for discussions in the fall when people return. It was Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. Never heard of him, never heard of it, but it was available for free. If you had a Cornell ID, you could sign in and you could read it online. I did end up actually purchasing a used copy because I didn't want to generate new sales, but I did end up purchasing a paper copy because I just wanted to have it. And it really was an eye-opener for me in terms of how pernicious this ideology is and how destructive it is, because the most quoted line from that book is that current discrimination is justified to remedy past discrimination, and future discrimination is justified to remedy current discrimination. So it is an open call for racial discrimination because of things that happened in the past. And so that ideology really feeds the entire DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion movement. It really feeds a lot of the philosophies on campus. In fact, in September of 2020, just 2 months after this initiative was launched, the several hundred Cornell faculty, staff, and students signed an open letter to the president, which is still online. I didn't count how many hundreds, but it was more hundreds than I could sit there and count. Let's put it that way, including faculty I knew, some from the law school, who adopted essentially a Kendi view, and what they felt the president's initiative should look like was essentially what Kendi argued. They wanted race-based hiring and promotion actually implemented at the university. There were some very bizarre things there, like this the university should keep track of the race of the spouses of people they hire, which to me, I still don't actually understand that. But this was really horrible. Fortunately, the university did not adopt that because it would be illegal. It would violate a number of laws. But my point is that the negative impact of this is that it is seeking to increase discrimination as opposed to decrease it. Again, the exact opposite of the American civil rights movement, the exact opposite of where we've been moving as a society for 50 years. And it really is a very regressive, not progressive, a very regressive philosophy which resegregates people, reintroduces skin color almost in a quasi South African style. You know, do you have a drop of blood in you of one racial group?
It's sort of like the antebellum South or
Yeah.
the Jim Crow South.
Yeah, it is. It's taking us way back, and that's why it's so destructive. And
especially in an increasingly multiracial society.
That's right. How you would even measure these things is strange. And they use terms such as people of color. Of course, when I was growing up, if you called somebody colored, that was a slur. Now they have adopted it, and that's now people of color. But what does that even mean? It's never explained. How much color do you have to have? Is somebody from Sicily who might have fairly dark skin? Is that a person of color? And what I don't think they count. What they really mean when they say that, they mean non-European.
Yeah.
So this is a movement.
Except for non-European Jews, I might add.
That's right, because non-European Jews, we know, if you read the New York Times or elsewhere, are just white. So yeah, I mean, it's a really negative thing. It's not just divisive. I mean, that's an understatement. It's not just divisive. It really is tears at the fabric of society. It tears at what holds us together. I mean, and it really is a power play that it is enable. It's a philosophy that enables the people who control the power on campuses and increasingly at human resources departments and corporations to wield power based on skin color. And what is worse for society than that?
Yeah, yeah, very true. Now, the talking point about critical race theory on the left and liberals has been, for the most part, that such concerns are merely conservative misinformation and it's just an arcane theory taught in college and isn't being taught in the schools. But this ADL curriculum was just one more example that shows that's a lie. Isn't this just the latest of many examples of it being exposed as having been promulgated in elementary and secondary schools? I know there's the Liberated Ethnic Studies program in California, but there are many other examples, aren't there?
That's right. What they want to do is they want to engage in this endless circular argument over what is critical race studies or what is not. And oh, that privilege wheel in your kindergarten classroom. Well, that's not critical race studies, okay? Or, the skin color charts in schools and things like that. And so we get into this endless argument. I saw a really good point the other day. It's not original to me that somebody made, that what has happened with wokeness more generally is that it's not necessarily something that's taught. It is now merged into the fabric of education. And so what they do is they don't want anything identified as critical race studies, even though it all stems from critical race studies, because if you can identify it and you can isolate it, then you can have an argument over it. But instead, it's just been infused into it. And as you know, we started a website, criticalrace.org, really as an outgrowth of what was happening at Cornell in the summer of 2020. And we document what's going on. And it is absolutely the fact that critical race studies or variations on it, such as anti-racism or diversity, equity, inclusion, are almost pervasive in higher education, almost pervasive, worse yet, in medical schools. Medical schools have moved very heavily. So I don't.
Which is kind of nuts. What would that have to do with killing people? But still,
that's right. Well, we saw that in New York State. I'm actually the named plaintiff in a lawsuit against the New York State Health Commissioner because in December of last year, when there were new therapeutics for COVID that came out, they were in very short supply. And New York State, kind of feeding off of this CRT view of the world, this DEI view of the world, passed handed out guidelines that prioritized access to those medicines based on race. So no matter what race you are or color you are, you had to have COVID, you had to test positive, you had to have symptoms, and you had to present yourself within 5 days of symptoms. But you then also had to show a personal risk factor. If you were non-white, and they never defined that, if you were non-white, merely being non-white was a personal risk factor, so you qualified. If you were white, however they defined that, you had to show you had heart disease or diabetes. So these theories you talked about earlier, why are these dangerous for society? Because it's not just that some loopy professor is teaching it in an upper level course at a law school someplace. Nobody really actually cares about that. Right. But it's being implemented. It's being implemented in hiring practices. There's just a lawsuit filed, I think it was a day or two ago, against Texas A&M over this. And it's manifesting itself in healthcare. So that's why this is so dangerous. It's not that we don't like critical race studies or something like that, or race theory. It really doesn't matter. It's that it's working its way into society in very negative ways.
Yeah. Let's drill down a bit again as to why critical race theory is linked to anti-Semitism. Now, some on the left claim that there's nothing anti-Jewish about discussing prejudice in America's past. But the willingness on the part of those who are involved in this to label Jews and Israel itself as possessors of white privilege is crucial here, isn't it?
Well, that's right. I mean, we saw this in the BDS movement long before anybody was talking about critical race theory or critical race studies. That the BDS movement, and I saw it in the early 80s at Cornell Law School, not Cornell, at Harvard Law School, was building coalitions against Israel based on affinity groups, based on so-called intersectionality. And I saw that in the early 80s. I didn't really understand what was going on. I now, in perspective, understand what was going on. So long before anyone, was talking about critical race theory on TV, there was a movement to demonize Israeli Jews as essentially white, part of the white power structure. And you can argue with them facts, but facts don't matter to them. Half the population is actually from Arab countries, et cetera, but it doesn't matter that Jews were viewed as part of the international colonialist, white supremacist, repressive society, and they would organize coalitions of people of color and indigenous peoples, as they would call them, against essentially the Jews. And so you have that background in the social justice movement, in the BDS movement, in the Black Lives Matter movement, which was formed by people who were anti-Israel, in the Black Lives Matter movement, because I followed it when they were formed, which were heavily infused with anti-Israel activists, the Ferguson riots, which really gave not birth to Black Lives Matter because it started after Trayvon Martin, but it really jumped to national prominence after the Michael Brown shooting and the Ferguson riots. I covered it at the time. I've got numerous posts how anti-Israel activists had embedded themselves in those riots and were redirecting them to be anti-Israel. And so this is something that predates us talking about critical race theory. It is a movement, though, that was deeply embedded in Black Lives Matter movement from the get-go, that Jews are essentially part of the problem. And when you infuse that with Palestinian nationalism and anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, bigotry, it becomes, Jews are part of the white problem, regardless of what their skin color is. And that's the height of anti-Semitism. So Jews have the precarious position of being not white enough for, Nazi-like, anti-Semites, but too white for left-wing anti-Semites.
Yeah, nothing new there. Everybody finds a reason to hate Jews if they look hard enough, and it's not that hard. As you say, one of the most infuriating aspects of this sort of critical race theory indoctrination is the way it treats lies and myths about race in America as truths. And that was especially true about the 2014 shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, which you just referenced. And yet, as you have already pointed out, the myths about Brown and the hands up, don't shoot were included in ADL's curricula. How has that come about? And exactly what was wrong about that? And what were the lies there that are still being blindly accepted throughout, much of American public discourse?
The Black Lives Matter movement, I've said this before, and it infuriated people where I work, was founded on two fundamental lies. One was the shooting of Trayvon Martin, which was deemed a racist shooting. In fact, we covered the trial every single day live at that time, and it was a fully justified self-defense shooting by George Zimmerman, who wasn't even white. The media coined a new phrase for him. He was a white Hispanic, because they wanted to push the racial narrative. And then the Michael Brown shooting. And the Michael Brown shooting really thrust Black Lives Matter to the forefront nationally, where the way ADL presents it in their materials, it's really a falsehood by omission. They say Michael Brown was a young black man who was unarmed, who was shot by a white policeman. And that's really all they tell you about it. And then they use that as the launching point to launch into various things about white privilege and racism and history. Well, what they don't tell you was that Michael Brown was a fairly large person with a criminal record who had just strong-armed a grocery store and who sucker punched a policeman who was sitting in his patrol car. Sucker punched him while he was seated in the car, punched him in the side of the face, grabbed for the policeman's gun, and this was all confirmed by forensics, was shot once. The policeman got out of the car. Michael Brown charged the policeman and was shot a second time, and that was the fatal shot. So Michael Brown was somebody who was in the process of physically attacking a policeman. So yes, it's true, he was black. Yes, it's true, he was unarmed, okay? Mm-hmm. But to leave it at that is a falsehood, and how ADL could do that. Now, ADL didn't, at least as I'm recalling the materials, talk about the hands up, don't shoot. But the Black Lives Matter movement adopted essentially as their core slogan, hands up, don't shoot. And you saw people marching in 2020 saying with their hands up, don't shoot. The myth about Michael Brown was that not only was he, just an innocent person attacked by police, but he had his hands up saying don't shoot. And there's no credible evidence to support that. Not only the local prosecutors found that conclusion, so did Eric Holder, who at the time was the U.S. Attorney General for Barack Obama.
No conservative.
No conservatives. Somebody who's black himself. And they conducted a thorough investigation, as they often do when a policeman's not charged, to see if there was a civil rights violation. And they found that there was no credible evidence that Michael Brown had his hands up and was saying, don't shoot. But ADL, while they don't use that particular, they use Michael Brown. They raise him to a status of somebody who was a victim of racism when he wasn't. He just wasn't. And how ADL could do that and justify that is really beyond belief. The only people who believe that, and maybe ADL believes it, are people who are so invested in the social justice movement, in the racial justice movement, that they ignore facts and they ignore evidence. And so ADL has a lot of answering to do on why they used Michael Brown. Of all the people, I mean, there have been obviously people who were killed because of racism, but Michael Brown's not one of them. So why are they using him?
Well, I think it's, it's, as you say, that's part of the origin story, although it wasn't the actual origin of the BLM movement. That is part of the origin story. So there's sort of, it seems to me, it's part of this effort to sort of stay in sync with liberal fashion, which has embraced Black Lives Matter. And that therefore, I mean, it's almost like an unthinking, as you say, critical race theory kind of insinuates itself throughout education. That I guess it was just considered by those involved as just one more, sort of natural for them to have invoked it.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a good example of how it has infused itself into the culture, and it has infused itself into a lot of groups, including groups like ADL, where they don't even question the underlying assumptions. And that's really the pernicious nature of it. It's not a course that is taught. It's not, the worst of it isn't even a particular training, although there have been many reports of horrific trainings, really race-shaming trainings. Mm-hmm. Those are visible. It's the invisible, the way it's permeated so much of society, that is the damage that critical race theory and its progeny have resulted in.
Yeah, let's focus a little more about the ADL. Recently, Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO of ADL, a former Clinton and Obama White House staffer, under whose leadership the group has taken a very sharp turn to the left. For a change, he actually acknowledged that there was left anti-Semitism and that this was a problem, although clearly not as much of a problem as he thinks right-wing anti-Semitism or his campaign up against Donald Trump. Do you think that there's a chance that ADL will fully repudiate CRT, actually eliminate it from all of its anti-hate programs? Because it seems to be very integral to their mindset otherwise, but there's sort of a conundrum there. How can you acknowledge left-wing anti-Semitism without really taking a stand against critical race theory and the way it enables anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism?
Well, I read one report, maybe it was in the Fox News story or someplace else, that ADL said, we absolutely do not promote critical race theory. So, and they don't, at least in those materials, they don't have the term critical race theory, but they're unable to see what they're doing. They're unable to
Yeah,
see.
because that's actually what they're doing.
That's right.
They don't put the label on it,
That's
but
right.
functionally, that's what they are endorsing. Even though, as you say, they
But they don't
claim
see
that
that.
definitely, period, we don't. But
They can't see that because it's so deeply infused in their worldview. And yes, absolutely, there are white supremacist groups who have a risk of violence. Okay, nobody can doubt that there are some of those, but there are also non-white extremist groups who have a risk of violence. I mean, nobody talks about the grocery market. I think it was in New Jersey that got attacked by a black supremacist, or the rabbi in Muncie, New York, who was stabbed by a black supremacist. So there's plenty of badness to go around all around, but ADL seems hyper focused on badness that fits its political left-wing narrative, and that's why they demonize Trump supporters. One of the more bizarre things ADL has done, it's like they had to be first, or when Brett Kavanaugh was announced to become Supreme Court, he would be nominated long before the stuff about what he did or didn't do in high school came out. Okay, they immediately issued a strong denunciation of the nomination.
yeah,
What
I've noted that myself. Within seconds, Greenblatt was tweeting about it.
How is that part of the mission of ADL? How is an organization which was founded to fight anti-Semitism, which still fundraises claiming it's fighting anti-Semitism, why are they getting involved in a Supreme Court fight over Brett Kavanaugh? It makes no sense. And it's because that's what they've become. They've become essentially a functional arm of the Democratic Party, just like Southern Poverty Law Center, just like so many other groups who start off independent, start off with a worthy mission, but over time, there's institutional capture. And I think ADL may not be captured yet, but there is serious concern that it's headed that way, if it's not there already, where it is simply viewed as a wing of a political party. And that's dangerous for the Jewish people, because when the most prominent fighter against anti-Semitism becomes viewed as a political partisan, that has negative repercussions for the Jewish community in general. And ADL seems to not see that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly a function. I mean, if we're trying to sort of pull back the camera lens a bit, throughout American society, certainly, politics now plays the role that religion used to play for most people in their lives. So it's sort of, we see this in everything. Everything becomes about politics. The arts become about politics. The sports become about politics. But it's interesting that, it's so much more crucial when politics takes over the fight against anti-Semitism. And at that point, there is no fight against anti-Semitism, because all they're fighting are political battles, not actual anti-Semitism, as much as you say, that's their brand. That's how they raise money. But I think, as you've noted, Greenblatt's done even better at fundraising than his predecessor, Abe Foxman, who was considered a master fundraiser, because he's tapping into this, this trend where politics is everything, and it impacts Jews as much as anybody else, and perhaps more so.
Yeah, I mean, based on ADL's publicly available Form 990s, which all nonprofits have to file, looks they've approximately doubled their fundraising since Greenblatt took over. I think the most recent one that's available was 2020, and I think they were just under $100 million. I assume it's much bigger now, because they've really ramped up operations. They had, at that time, based on their certified financial statements, $220 million in the bank. Okay, so I mean, it's not literally in the bank, but in assets. So ADL is doing very well at one level financially and structurally under Greenblatt. What they're not doing well on is fighting anti-Semitism, which is supposed to be what their mission is. So from an institutional, organizational building viewpoint, I could see why the board of trustees there keeps him on. But if the measure is, are they effectively fighting anti-Semitism? I think the answer is unequivocally not. They simply have now made themselves part of the political back and forth and have really burned bridges to anyone who is right of center. And that's not healthy for the fight against anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I also think that part of the problem here is media coverage. It was telling that outside of Fox News, which reported it, and some media, Jewish media like JNS, the ADL critical race theory story was largely ignored. Although, had the New York Times reported on it, they would have probably lauded ADL for embracing critical race theory. There's irony there. But does this reflect a real consensus about liberals and the left, among liberals and the left, that critical race theory and Black Lives Matter ideology, which, as we've said, is really inextricably linked to anti-Semitism, is now mainstream thinking? And to what extent has the media been complicit in propagating these toxic myths, not just about Michael Brown, but about the whole array of sort of BLM and CRT ideology?
Yeah, I mean, I think that ADL, unfortunately, has now become a participant in this. It has become a vehicle for it. One of the worst things they're doing is they are leading the fight to censor people on the internet. Mm-hmm. They formed a group, I can't remember what it's called, but there was a group formed to force advertisers off of Facebook because Facebook had, in their view, done something wrong. I don't even remember which list of horribles it was, but Facebook had done something wrong, and they wanted.
Yeah, they embrace, Sacha Baron Cohen's, famous, when he called out Mark Zuckerberg for allowing Nazis on Facebook, and that became a big winner for them. That was part of their big fundraising program.
Yeah, so I think what happened is because Facebook wasn't cracking down enough on people, there was a movement with the usual suspects who are always trying to boycott conservative advertisers and platforms and get people not to advertise on, at the time, Rush Limbaugh or Tucker Carlson, chase away advertisers, organized to chase away advertisers from Facebook. And there was a website, again, I'm not remembering what it was called, but when I clicked on the website and I looked a little deeper down in the website, it was an ADL run website. So ADL was running a website to get advertisers to stop advertising on Facebook because Facebook wouldn't crack down on groups at all. And this is a point I've made many times, that when you go down the road of, quote unquote, hate speech must be banned from social media. Well, who gets to define hate speech? ADL thinks they are in a power position to define hate speech the way they want. But I have news for ADL. There are a lot of people who consider what ADL says to be hate speech. There are a lot of people on campuses who consider being a Zionist to be hate speech. So when ADL justifies and weaponizes censorship in the cause of cracking down on hate speech, what it doesn't realize is that it's putting itself at risk because it becomes a power play. Who gets to define what hate speech is? And that's really the problem. Now, I'm not talking about organizing violence and things like that. That's illegal. And if Facebook hasn't been cracking down on groups organizing violence through chat rooms or whatever, they should be called out on that. But when we get into this thing like the Southern Poverty Law Center does, where they have their hate watch lists and they have all these other things, that has serious repercussions, and it's not part of ADL's mission, and it's very dangerous because then you are empowering people on campuses, like I think it was Berkeley, is no longer, student groups signed a statement saying that they're no longer going to allow Zionist speakers or pro-Zionists to be on campus to appear at the law school because that's hate speech. And this is the sort of stuff ADL, how do we defend that now when ADL is out there saying that, well, people who engage in hate speech, of course, shouldn't be allowed to speak. Okay, now a bunch of student groups at Berkeley Law School have defined being pro-Zionist as hate speech. That's where ADL has left us.
Yeah, revolutions eat their children, and as much
Yeah.
as ADL seems to be desperate and has done it somewhat successfully, I think we both concede to stay in sync with liberal fashion and to sort of stay, be where sort of the correlation of forces on the left would seem to indicate they should be in order to, be maximize their position in the end, to the extent that even to the minimal extent that they stay true to their mission of defending the Jewish people, speaking up for Israel, which they still occasionally pay lip service to, although it's clearly not a priority, they're going to find themselves in trouble. And of course, occasionally that's already happened. There was the whole thing where leftists forced Starbucks to sort of push ADL out of doing their anti-racism training programs because ADL isn't anti-racist enough for the left.
And there's a big movement on campuses directed at ADL. It was started by the misnamed Jewish Voice for Peace, which is really a sick organization that I've followed for many years, called I'm forgetting the name of it. They've got a program attacking
the Deadly Exchange program, which is itself, I would just label it just it's an anti-Semitic bloodline.
Yeah, my brain computer froze for a second. Thank you for unlocking it. So Deadly Exchange is something that we followed from the start, and it actually grew out of Ferguson. People don't understand this. In Ferguson, one of the tactics the anti-Israel activists used was to get people in Gaza to say from Ferguson to Gaza, from Ferguson to Palestine, that U.S. policing problems emanated from Israeli, not only were similar to how Israel treated Palestinians, but also emanated from training that U.S. police did in Israel. And one of the things spread in 2014 is that the police chief from Ferguson had done police training in Israel. Therefore, Israel and the Jews are responsible for anything a Ferguson policeman did. In addition, and that was actually not true. The Ferguson police chief had not gone to Israel. The Israel training, which was sponsored and still is by the ADL, is high-level anti-terrorism training. It's not street policing.
It was actually for first responders, basically.
Yeah, and it was and anti-terrorism efforts. It was the police chief of St. Louis County who went. So they had the wrong person to begin with. The training was not on policing methods; it was on anti-terrorism methods. But that gave rise to what is now spreading on campuses called Deadly Exchange. That Israel and Jewish organizations like ADL are responsible for police killings of blacks in the U.S. They even use completely absurd examples, like they used during Ferguson, that Israeli police bought tear gas canisters from the same U.S. manufacturer that the Ferguson police bought the tear gas canisters. So what does one have to do with the other? So there's a U.S. manufacturer of tear gas, and the Israeli police and the Ferguson police bought from them. But that was used to somehow illogically make the connection that if you're in a protest in Ferguson and you get tear gassed, it's the Jews to blame. The Jews trained the police. The Jews have a connection to the tear gas company. And so when you look at Black Lives Matter and you look at left-wing anti-Semitism, it's very much Farrakhan-style anti-Semitism. It's very much, the black supremacist wing of that movement, anti-Semitism that we've seen for a long time. And it's really something that now has worked its way into the mainstream of the left, Democratic Socialists of America, the Squad. You see these things that, they sometimes are careful what they say, but hey, it's all about the Benjamins, baby, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's exactly right. And you're referencing, of course, Ilhan Omar.
That's right. Yes. Don't nobody quote me as that's not original to me.
Yes. Who, basically is a BDS supporter, an anti-Semite, and who has at times been defended by the ADL against criticism from Donald Trump because she was a woman of color.
I mean, another example is ADL has made it toxic to criticize George Soros. If you criticize George Soros, and this is really largely due to ADL, but it's very convenient for the left also, that any criticism of George Soros is deemed anti-Semitic. So if you say that George Soros funded prosecutors who want leniency in prosecution and don't want to prosecute certain levels of violent criminals, oh, that's anti-Semitic because it's George Soros. It's factually true.
And in fact, George Soros boasted about it in the pages
He boasted
of the Wall
about
Street
it
Journal.
in, I think it was the Wall Street Journal recently.
Right.
It's demonstrably true that that's what he's doing. But ADL has, because it's become so partisan, now any criticism, any invocation of the name of George Soros is automatically deemed anti-Semitic. Now, there certainly are some people who have anti-Semitic, sort of uses of George Soros, but that's not the majority. But we've gotten to the point where, for political purposes, we cannot criticize one of the major funders of the democratic activist infrastructure and the democratic political infrastructure. That person can no longer be criticized because ADL has deemed criticism of George Soros to be anti-Semitic. And that thing gets weaponized against people who have legitimate policy concerns. And of course, George Soros, I forget which publication it was, I think it was the Free Beacon many years ago, obtained documents showing he has funded much of the anti-Israel movement around the world. So he's fair game for criticism, but ADL, for political partisan purposes, tries to shut down that criticism by claiming it's anti-Semitic.
Yes, I think that's a very important point. One of the most discouraging elements of this is that if the ADL, which is still treated by the media and political leaders as the gold standard for judging anti-Semitism and monitoring it, if it has abandoned its brief and is now just another liberal left advocacy group, which I think we both agree is true, who is going to stand up against anti-Semitism at a time when there is a rising hatred, tide of Jew hatred spreading across the globe? I mean, it's a failure of Jewish leadership, but there's a tremendous vacuum here because everybody still looks to the ADL and they're not doing their job.
I mean, it's a problem. I think that they are so large and they are so dominant on the scene and they have so many resources that there are certainly great groups fighting anti-Semitism, but none of them come anywhere close to the power of ADL, to the finances of ADL, to the political influence of ADL. So it's a real problem. And I think I can't speak for all critics of the ADL. I can only speak for myself. I want them to do better. Okay. I'm not somebody who's, tear down the ADL for the sake of tearing down the ADL. I feel very betrayed by them. It's not the way I grew up thinking of them and what they've turned into. And I'd like them to get back to their mission. And I'd like them to get out of the partisan political fights that they always seem to inject themselves into. Next time there's a Supreme Court nomination, regardless of who's nominated and who's being, doing the nominating, there's no reason for ADL to be involved in it. There's zero reason for that. And so I think that, I want them to succeed, but what they're doing now is not success.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And they've gotten into lots of other fights they shouldn't have gotten into. And as we've seen with the curricula, they are doing things that a group that is going to be against anti-Semitism should not be doing. Bill, thanks so much for joining us again. It was great having you back on the show. Those wanting to know more about these issues should follow Legal Insurrection, the blog, at criticalrace.org. And we also want to thank our audience. Whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, or on JBS TV, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and think for yourself. And we'll see you again next week.